Good morning, everybody. As you heard, my name is Sarah. I'm one of the pastors here. If we haven't met yet, I would love to meet you after the service and just get to know you a little bit. Before we really get into the message that I believe that God has given me or, walked me through over the last few weeks, I want to check in with you about how your last week went. And so what we are doing each week, we have a theme called Influenced, right? And if you were here last week, you had the privilege of listening to Mike give a message with his daughter Evelyn, which was a lot of fun. And they gave us a little bit of a homework assignment. So if you didn't do it, you're not in trouble. You're going to get a second chance. But if you did do it, I want to check in with you about how that went for you. So whether or not you did or didn't do it, here's what we were invited into. We were invited into a practice, so to ask 2 questions in the morning and in the evening about what voices, what messages are competing for our attention in that day. And so what is God's invitation for me today? So those were the 2 questions. So what I want you to do right now, what I'm inviting you to do right now, is turn towards someone near you. So I'm going to ask you to do something brave for the introverts in the room. I get it. I believe it or not, I am one, and we can still talk to people near us. You're invited to turn someone near you. It can be someone new, someone you've never met before. It can be someone you came with. It doesn't matter. So what I want you to do is turn to them and talk about this for a minute. Can you answer these questions together? What are the things that you notice? So it doesn't have to be some profound thought, right? It doesn't have to be super tidy, but go ahead and take about 60 seconds, turn towards someone near you, and answer, what voices did you notice competing for your attention this week? And did anything surprise you when you asked what God's invitation was? Okay? Ready? Go. All right, y'all, come on back. If you want to talk more about this later, you certainly can. I love how much we love each other in this room. So here's what I want you to know before we go anywhere else today. What you were paying attention to this week, that's formation. So that's some of what we're talking about when we're talking about being influenced. You were already practicing Romans 8 before you knew it. So this week we're talking about Romans 8. So those 2 questions weren't just journaling exercises. They were you practicing something actually ancient, something that Paul writes about in Romans 8. So you were practicing living out, moving towards the life that you were made for. So let's look at Romans 8, 5-6 for a moment. It says, "Those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace." So there's a word here that Paul uses that doesn't fully translate into the English language. So we're going to talk about that briefly just to give a little bit more depth to this study. It's the word mind in Greek, which is the language that Paul is writing Romans in. It's called phronema. And it doesn't mean a single thought that you have on a random Tuesday. What phronema is the habitual bent of your attention. It's the thing that your mind returns to when nothing else is demanding it. What do we think about when our mind starts to wander? It's what you drift toward. right? It's what steers your ship. Oh, hey, okay. Hang on one moment, people. Okay, we good? All right. I have a lot of hair and small ears, so we're going to do what we can do this morning. So if you're here today and you're not sure what you believe about any of this, that is okay. So I would just invite you to stay curious. I would invite you to notice. So what Paul is describing in Romans 8, this restless striving, the voice that says, you're not enough, you've probably felt that, whether you feel like you know Jesus or you don't. So notice whether it leads you into a life of peace and life or not. And wherever you are in your journey with and towards Jesus, you are more than welcome in this conversation. Some of us drift toward worry. Some of us drift toward comparison. So I'm just giving you some examples, but these are some of what I've found are some of the more universal experiences. Some of us drift toward our mental to-do list that never actually ends. Some of us drift toward shame or what we feel like we have to do today. But let's look back on those verses for a moment. It says, if I set my mind on the things of the flesh, so that is doing things my own way, how I think things need to be done in order to get them to work out, that is death. Which feels dramatic, but we felt it, right? If we're honest with ourselves, we felt it. And if I set my mind on things of the Spirit, that is life and peace. So that thing that you did last week that I invited you again to do this morning, the noticing is part of moving our attention to ways of thinking that lead to peace and to life. What we pay attention to forms us, the noticing. That's part of, it forms us not just in the big moments, but in how our thoughts and our minds are positioned every day. So where our minds are positioned either pulls us away from life and peace, or it leads us closer to the life that we were created for. Where our minds are positioned either pulls us away from life and peace, or it leads us closer to the life that we were created for. Romans 8, 1-2 says, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Jesus Christ from the law of sin and death. I believe that a lot of us came in here today already feeling behind. I believe that a lot of you came in here tired. Is that a fair guess? Already carrying something we didn't quite put down from the week. We're already hearing the whispers of the voice that says, you're not enough, or you're too much. Or weirdly enough, sometimes it's both. You're not enough, you're too much. And here is something that I want you to leave today knowing. Paul has a name for that voice, and it is called the flesh. And before you picture something dramatic, Paul isn't talking about the obvious stuff. He's not talking about, when he says the flesh, he's not just talking about what we think of when we think of our worst sins, our biggest mistakes. Sometimes living according to the flesh doesn't look like what we think of as sin. Sometimes it looks like striving and performing, like trying to hold everything together so nothing falls apart, like needing to be okay so that everyone else can be okay, or needing everyone else to be okay so we can be okay. When Paul talks about the flesh, he means the part of you that forgot you were loved and started trying to earn it. He means the part of you that forgot you were loved and started trying to earn it. And I don't know about you, but when I was studying this chapter, I could feel that like deep in my bones. The part that strives and performs and compares and controls, and we all have it. It's just our default when we've drifted away from how we've been created to be, which is to be at home and at peace and living our lives with God. So I'm going to slow down for a moment, and I have a few questions for you to consider. Not to answer out loud, just let them land somewhere in your body, okay? If you need to, some of us are journalers, you're welcome to write. Pull out your paper. You can write in response or just be in this moment. Where do you feel like you're most running on empty right now? Where have you been striving to earn something you already have? What are you most afraid people would see if you actually slowed down? The answers to those questions can give you some clues, can give us some clues as to where we may have wandered from being at home with God. Noticing where you've wandered isn't failure, by the way. It's information. It's saying, hey, here is an invitation to reconnect with who you've been made to be. Right? Many of us know that I work with teens as a youth pastor, but I also work as a counselor with kids and parents. And one of the most important things about a relationship between a kid and a parent is repair. And so when we've drifted away, saying, hey, let's come back. Let's address this. It's not the mistakes, it's not the wandering away, it's the repair. And so I'm inviting you, any of those voices of shame that are tempted to creep in, that say, oh, I messed up again. I really am not good enough. We're going to put those aside for now. And I'm happy to talk with you about them if you would like later. And I just want you to look at it for a moment as information and an opportunity to repair and to come back together with the God of the universe who loves you better than anyone else ever could. There's a principle in physics, so I'm not a physicist. I do a lot of things, but I'm not a scientist. But I can tell you that scientists have discovered that an atom actually changes just by being observed. The act of watching it does something to it. Attention isn't passive. Noticing isn't passive. It's not neutral. And I find myself wondering if God wired it that way on purpose, if that noticing isn't just the first step toward change. It seems that attention in itself creates, is purposeful. And where you place your gaze, where you put your attention, something begins to move. Which means those two questions that you were asking yourselves last week, they weren't just journaling. They weren't just checking off the box so you can tell Mike and Evelyn that you did the thing. They were active participation in something that God is already doing. I would suggest that the Spirit was already moving in the noticing. Paul gives us 3 ways in the book of Romans in chapter 8, 3 different ways to see what's happening in us, and none of them are meant to produce shame again. They're meant to produce noticing. So if you look at the entirety of chapter 8, we see something called, well, he doesn't call it this, but we'll see deformation. And I'm going to tell you what that is and how you're going to notice it as you read this chapter on your own. It's places where we've been actively pulled away from wholeness and where something true has been bent. Right? So maybe it's where that voice comes in and says, "You're not enough." And we start to feel shame about that. But what if the truth is we don't actually have to be enough for everyone? Right? That's not our job. That's the one who made us. We do what we can and he makes up the rest, and that's enough. Misinformation, places where we've been shaped by something that's true-ish but not quite right. A half-truth that over time became a whole belief. And then we see transformation, places where we're noticing something shifting. Even slowly, when we say, "Hey, okay, I'm not where I want to be today." All right, that's the invitation to transformation. That's the noticing is the first part of the shifting. So even slowly, even just a little. We're not trying to necessarily fix it all ourselves. We are trying to be honest about where we are. And that's enough. That is work. That's actually the beginning of moving towards change. Noticing where we wandered is the first step back toward the life that we were made for. We're going to look at a few verses in Romans, and I'm just going to give you some things that Paul tells us about what God does for us. And the reason we're not reading the whole chapter of Romans, it would probably take half of our sermon time. It is so rich and so good. And so I would encourage you to go home and read it yourself several times, but I'm going to give you some of the highlights that stuck out to me, what I learned, and then if you want to come next week and tell me what you learned, I want to hear all about it. Romans 8:26 says that the Spirit helps us in our weakness. Romans 8:11, get this, says that if you know Jesus, the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, that Spirit lives in you. Not near you and not available to you if you pray hard enough or get it together enough or say or do the right things. That Spirit is in you. And it's not a metaphor. That is your actual condition in this room, in this body, right now. And we read that, and I think it's easy to move past that a little too quickly because some of us have been attending church for a long time, and we're like, yep, Jesus was raised from the dead, and I have that Spirit. And we sort of just go past because it's really hard to wrap our minds around. But this morning we're going to take a moment and we're going to sit with it. We hear about resurrection power and we nod because we've heard about it, because it sounds familiar. I don't think we always let it land in our bodies. I want to invite you to think about what the resurrection actually is. It's not resuscitation. It's not just, oh, we're almost dead, but oh, we got rescued, right? Resurrection is a body that was completely spent, completely done, being made into something that death cannot touch anymore. And Paul tells us that that same power lives in you, in your anxious body, in your exhausted mind, in the version of you that maybe showed up today running on fumes. I wonder if you didn't come here today to get more information about God. I wonder if you came because something new. Something in you knew. You needed to be reminded of the thing that makes dead things come alive again. So I want to tell you, before you dive into Romans chapter 8 on your own, maybe this week, it's not about trying harder. It is a chapter that invites us into the life for which we are created. Paul isn't handing you a self-improvement plan or a checklist. He's not asking you to muster more willpower or set better habits or be more disciplined about your quiet time or get up earlier. We're going to look at a few more words that Paul uses in this chapter. In verse 6 of chapter 8, he says, "The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace." Life and peace, that's shalom. So shalom is like wholeness. It's not the absence of stress. It's not the absence of hard things. It's integrated and it's rooted. It's the kind of peace that holds you when everything around you seems to be crumbling. In verse 5, it says, "The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship." You're not an employee trying to earn a place at the table. You are not a servant who has to perform to stay in good standing. You are not trying to prove yourself. We are beloved children. That is your identity before it is your task. I want to pause here just for a moment because I know that some of us have grown up in homes where we believed, and a lot of times for good reason, that we had to earn our place in the family, and that's not what we're talking about here. Okay, when Paul talks about adoption in Roman culture was you get all of the rights as a child of mine. You get it all. And there's nothing that you do to earn it, okay? So if that's something, we're going to have an opportunity later to ask God where he's inviting us into, and there might be someone or more than someone's in this room who needs to talk to God about that. I was and am. And so I'm super sensitive to that, and if you need to just stay right here and be with God in this verse, go just soak up verse 15. But for the rest of us, or for those of you who want to hear more, in we're in verses, in chapter 8. Verse 26, it says, "In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans." Even when you can't pray. Ever had those moments? I can't even talk to God right now. Even when you're too tired or too numb or too scattered or too angry or too disappointed, the Spirit is praying in you and for you. You are never behind with God. You cannot fall so far behind that the Spirit stops praying, interceding, talking to the Father on your behalf. Jesus didn't come to give you a better version of your striving life. He came to invite you into a completely different way of living. So if you know Jesus, the same Spirit that resurrected his body and his mind and his spirit lives in you right now, and that's not a reward for getting it right and for doing enough and for being enough or not making too many people upset. It's how you connect to the peace and the life God came to give you, which is to be at home with God. So for this week's practice, I'm not going to give you something new. You've already practiced. I want you to keep the two questions that you've been asking in the morning and the evening. And if you haven't had a chance to do that, I want to invite you to start checking in with yourself, checking in with God in the morning and the evening. So as a reminder, those questions are, let's slow down. Let's slow down, Sarah. What voices are competing for my attention today? And what is God's invitation for me today? So I'll invite you to keep writing them down like Mike and Evelyn invited you to do already, and keep looking for those patterns. But I'm going to add one small thing to this exercise. When you write down what you notice, I want you to put a simple symbol next to it. You can pick different symbols if they're more meaningful to you, but here's what I'll suggest. An arrow pointing right if that voice is pulling you away from life and peace, and an arrow pointing left if that voice feels more toward the life God came to give you. That's it. You're not fixing anything. You're not striving towards anything. We're not panicking and saying we have to fix this right now. You're just learning. You're just practicing telling the difference. So sometimes our brains need something to grab onto when we say, hey, here's what we're going to do. Do this week. So what I'm going to do is I am going to ask you to practice this right now. But before I do, Cindy and Marcel, would you mind coming up? So I'll give you what we're going to do. I'm going to invite you to practice this right now, so later on this week, your mind has something to grab onto, has something to remind you, what are we doing this week? So you can do this on your phone. If you're a paper journaler, if you brought one of those, you can use it, whatever you brought. If you don't have anything, you can just sit and practice doing it within your own self. So we're going to answer those questions right now on our own. So what voices are competing for my attention today? So that's your first question. And what is God's invitation for me today? And so before we get in our worship time, I'd love for you, I'm inviting you into, let's practice this. Okay, put those little arrows, whatever makes the most sense to you. Is this thought pulling me away? Does it seem like it's pulling me away from the life that Jesus came to give me, or does it seem like it's pulling me towards? And then once you do that, what is God's invitation for me today? And some of us will be on the sides if some of you need prayer. If you're saying, hey, I have an invitation, this is really scary, whatever the feelings are, we're happy to pray for you. Some of you may need to go reconcile with someone in the room or make a commitment to reconcile with someone out of the room. I don't know what God's going to invite you to do or to be or to move toward today, but we're just going to take, 3 or 4 minutes and just be with God. And I challenge you to be brave and to really listen to what are those things that I've kind of shut out, because it's really uncomfortable, because it makes me feel embarrassed. I feel really shameful. I should have this together because whatever your reason is for supposing to have it together. So take those few minutes. There'll be people in the front or on the sides ready to pray for you if that's something you need. Go talk to someone if you need to, and then we're going to move into a time of worship before we close our time today. Okay? All right.